we weren't trying to design something that would replace sex education, but rather complement the sex education that people were receiving already in their school system. So consider how their own identities fit in, how their faith values fit in to this kind of decision making. At that point, it was very one size fits all and not really making any space for any sort of values-based decision making. It also led to a lot of confusion for Muslim young people who were, at home receiving other messages or in their mosques.
Welcome, everybody, to the Pioneers of Possibility podcast. I'm your host, Kareem Afzal. Here on the Pioneers of Possibility, we're the podcast that focus on our guests and their life experiences that have led them to create meaningful change in the world, themselves, their communities, and the organizations that they serve. With us this week, I'm really excited. As somebody that I've known and our family foundation has supported for quite a few years is Nadiah Mohajir. From Heart Women and Girls. Nadiah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be able to share a little bit more about the work of Heart. As mentioned, my name is Nadiah Mohajir, and I am a mom before anything else. I have 3 children, and I live in Chicago, and I got my training in public health, and I've spent the majority of my career working in the area of reproductive and sexual health and violence spaces. And about 15 years ago, I was working in the Department of Health and Human Services, the Office of Women's Health, Region 5. So it was the Midwest office. And that's sort of where Heart was kind of born. It was born out of a need. My boss at the time kind of asked us, what would it look like for you to plan and execute a program or a campaign that was reaching Muslim women and girls. And so we convened a group of stakeholders, community teachers and principals and doctors and moms. And we said, what could we do with this money and what could we do? And so what we did was on November 9th, 2009, it was a health and wellness day that brought mothers and daughters together to talk about things together and then also separately in age appropriate developmental groups. And we discussed, relationships and sex ed and menstruation and puberty and peer pressure, and really thinking about the fact that we thought we would kind of move on from that onto the next project. And instead what happened was 80 women, 80 moms and daughters came together, and instead they were just like, when's the next one? We want to keep talking about this. And so that's how Heart Women and Girls was born. That is our legal name. And over the years, what we learned was the Women and Girls was sort of communicating something that we did not want to communicate to the community. And that is that this work is only for women and girls. And instead we wanted to have a more expansive conversation and include people of all genders and identities in this conversation, because we all have a sort of role to play in building sexually literate and healthy communities that are free of violence. And so, as you can see on social media, on our website, we refer to ourselves as Heart to Grow, which is a national nonprofit that, provides culturally relevant reproductive and sexual health education, addresses gender-based violence, and ultimately our goal is to equip Muslim communities with the knowledge and the tools that they need to make informed decisions about their health and safety.
That is really terrific. Now I want to go back a little bit into something you talked about earlier. So you were working at HHS. They asked you to put together a program to address the Muslim community. So there must have been some sort of needs assessment that said there is this gap. So to tell us what research formed that assessment. I mean, we know what that is, but I'd like to understand
I'll actually
what that
say they're like, okay, so obviously I knew, as a Muslim woman who was working at HHS, I knew what the gaps were. My supervisor, she, was wanting to, like, for her it was like, I'm interested in sort of reaching this community that I haven't been able to reach before, and now that I have Muslim women on my team, this is the perfect opportunity so that, you know, I don't have to lead that work, but Muslim women themselves can like sort of lead that work, which I really appreciated, because too often we have this like top down or white savior sort of approach to this work. And instead, you know, she was like, there's no need for me to be a part of this conversation. You all know your community best, and I want you to sort of take this bucket of money and run with it. And so, you know, the research was both from my myself and my co-founders' academic training in public health, knowing what we knew about hard to reach communities when it came to sex ed programs, and then of course we convened the group of stakeholders to further confirm what we already knew. And then finally afterwards, when we were done with the program, that's when my supervisor said, you might have untapped a need here, and a special niche. And so sure enough, like, the research was showing that the sex education programming in America in particular was one, across the board inadequate, right? Depending on the school district, depending on the region of the country, it varied. There were no standards for sex education. And then more importantly, when you got to more culturally specific communities and faith specific communities, that sex education was further limited. So either it was non-existent, or if it was existent, it was sort of, you know, limited to hygiene and what you can and cannot do, and you know, the faith rules around that, and not necessarily a comprehensive approach that included, you know, important topics like consent and contraception and healthy and safe relationships. And so, you know, what we learned from talking to our organizational partners that were already kind of doing this work was that there it was kind of screaming at us that there's a need for sex education that was no longer one size fits all, and that, you know, we weren't trying to design something that would replace sex education, but rather complement the sex education that people were receiving already in their school systems, whether that was a public school or private school system, and really coming in and sort of inviting people to be able to also consider how their own identities fit in, how their faith values fit in, to this kind of decision making. And right now, or at that point, the way sex education was, it was very secular. It was very, you know, again, one size fits all, and not really making any space for any sort of values based decision making. But, you know, just really focused on the nitty gritty, which is important. I don't want to discount that, but it also led to a lot of confusion for Muslim young people who were, you know, at home receiving other messages, or in their mosques and in their Sunday schools receiving other messages about, you know, sex just being bad, and, you know, not being relevant to them because they were young and not married.
As a child of immigrant parents, so my mother was Swedish, my father was from India. They came here in 1965 and 6 and met and didn't go back. I can say that there's a dearth of sex education in our communities, period. And most of it, including myself and my family, but my father probably will be upset at hearing this, but you know, I learned about it in 5th grade, right? So you learned about it in the sex education talk. You come home and say, Mommy, I learned this in school. And they kind of get pink in the face and sort of move on to the topic, right? So, but as we have moved into the information age, you know, our children and young people in general have a very, you know, information is at their fingertips, and very unhealthy education is also at their fingertips, unfortunately. So the work that you are doing and Heart is doing to put our stamp on how this can be communicated to our communities is really invaluable.
Thank you.
So let's talk about, you know, your first programming that Heart underwent. So what was that?
We did sort of begin with the intention of increase, sexual health literacy of Muslim communities. And I think what we realized very quickly, when we did that work, was as soon as you build trust and safety with people, people come forward with all sorts of confidential stories and questions. After that, more often than not, many of these stories, they ranged from stories about unhealthy relationships to stories about sexual violence, abuse, and spiritual abuse, right? And all of these stories were laden with stigma, with shame, with I have to do this alone because I can't tell my parents, or I can't tell my community because they're going to shame me or they're going to disown me, etc. And so what we realized was a critical component of teaching sex education is also teaching people to understand and practice consent, to identify when something is wrong, and most importantly, to know and seek help for when they or someone that they know is in an unsafe relationship, or an abusive relationship. And I think one of the things that I'm drawing upon from my public health training is really understanding access from both a individual level, as well as a lot of the structural barriers that come to
Access to
access to health
information.
and information, health services, reproductive health care in general. Understanding that from like, what do I need as an individual, but also recognizing there are community, institutional, and structural barriers that are also kind of standing in the way. So I could be someone who grows up in a community where there's a reproductive health clinic across the street, and my school has the best sex education program in the entire country. And I could have all the access I need or want, in practically. And if my mom doesn't allow me to go to sex ed, or if I come from a community that makes me feel unsafe from walking into the doors of that reproductive health clinic, I am not going to have access or try to like seek access to those services. Overall, our programming, it really promotes a culture of consent, which is inspired by this Islamic concept that we've learned about and really deepened our understanding around, called Rida, which means the fullness of choice. And what we mean by that is, like, in order for someone, for me as an individual, to be able to access agency and practice informed consent, or be in fullness of choice over anything, my body, my healthcare, my safety, I have to have access to the range of options that are available to me in my life, right? So that's not just including health education and health information, but that's also including the systems and the resources that support these choices. So our programming kind of takes this approach where we're not just wanting to equip the individual, we're wanting to equip their communities, right? We want to make it easy for people to access this information. And one of the things that we've done in the most recent years, like I would say in the last, 7 to 10 years, is our work with Muslim feminist scholars to really, really deepen our understanding of Islamic, like the diverse Islamic opinions that there are out there about all the different topics that intersect with reproductive and sexual health, so that people understand that in addition to them having comprehensive understanding of like the medical and biological understanding of what's happening, to also understand that Islam doesn't have like one opinion on any one topic, whether it comes to family planning, whether it comes to a pregnancy loss and abortion, right? Like there's a number of ways that our scholars have thought about it. We feel that it is extremely important for Muslims who are navigating critical decision making and common and complex reproductive health and violence experiences, to be able to have access to all of the opinions, so that they can make an opinion that they can make a decision that feels good for them and their spiritual contentment.
And scholarship is still evolving, right? So on these topics, because a lot of these topics were not present 1400 years ago.
That's where I'm going to challenge you there. Actually, a lot of these topics were actually very present, and there are that in a lot of the work actually that we've done has gone back to some of these traditional sources to see what was the opinion on birth control, what was the opinion on abortion back then. And I think what is interesting for that we've learned is that the impact of like white Christian supremacy and colonialism, particularly in the West, has really deeply impacted the ways in which we think about these issues in postmodern like America, right? Because before colonialism, a lot of these issues were non-issues. Like let's take one of the most sensitive and controversial issues in our community, abortion. Pre-colonialism, it was typically a topic of concern between the pregnant person and their midwife. And rarely did the state have to get involved or religious scholarship had to get involved, right? So it was a lot less stigmatized back then as it is now. And who do we have to thank for that? Well, white Christian supremacy and like right-wing nationalism and like the politicization of these topics that are actually just everyday lived experiences for people.
I really appreciate that, because the politicization of that and generally everything in society has really hamstrung not just our communities, but communities really all over the world. Even breaking that down, because the Muslim community in the United States and America is very, very diverse, right? So you have a large immigrant population, and different parts of the South Asian deal with this issue differently than folks from the Arab community.
A couple years ago, we launched a survey. It was a national study looking at the prevalence of sexual violence, sexual dysfunction, and spiritual abuse in Muslim communities among ages 18 to 45 in US and Canada. The sexual dysfunction section actually asked, we were working with a gynecologist who kind of gave us an evidence-based tool to form the questions around, just pain with sex and sexual pain. And we got a number like 44% of our respondents were reporting consistent pain with sex. And then of those respondents, they were asked, have you sought help for this? Right? And 66% of them said no. And then we asked them a reason why. Why did you not ask? Why did you not ask for help? And there were questions like, I was too embarrassed. I didn't know who to ask. I thought it was normal, etc. And so we had all of those reasons being pretty equally distributed. Like there was a fair number of people who were like, I was just too ashamed, and equally fair number of people saying, I just thought it was normal. And then an equally fair number of people saying, I didn't know who to ask, right? And so that indicates, all of those things indicate your ability to be in fullness of choice. If you don't even know that this is a problem, how are you going to be in fullness of choice? If you don't have the money or insurance to access healthcare, you're not going to be in fullness of choice, right? So like there's a lot of factors that contribute to that. And we've, with our programming and our small organization, we've tried to address what we can, because we do we provide health education, but then we also provide, we have a mutual aid fund so that folks who may need additional financial assistance, they have that access. Along with the mutual aid fund, we also have a referral network.
And the aid fund is to support aid for what?
So the mutual aid fund is for Muslims who are navigating common and complex reproductive health and violence experiences. So it's for survivors of violence who might need to seek emergency housing or retain a lawyer for filing for divorce. It could be someone who is seeking reproductive health care and doesn't and may have access to pay for a medical bill, but doesn't have the access to pay for childcare to get to that medical appointment, right? So like that's the kind of mutual aid work that we've been doing, so that we kind of make it a little bit easier. I mean, these issues are so physically and emotionally and financially draining. We can't say that we're impacting them so incredibly, but like we do want to say that like we're making it we're relieving the burden of something for them so that they're able to actually be able to not have to worry about one less thing.
I mean, that fund's an incredible resource to the community. And I guess I'll get to a question in a second about how you're communicating that fund. But just on the last piece on the education part, and then we'll move on to the sexual violence advocacy. That really is, I've read through the entire Rahma report 3 times today to really digest that. Where are you seeing the best traction in the education piece, right? So you talked about you had a small group with moms and kids that you separated. And then also you did some work on college campuses.
Yes.
So where are you seeing the most traction?
I would still say it's like college campuses and like the broader community in that age group. So, you know, young Muslims from 18 to like 35 is like where we are seeing the most traction. Likely because, you know, they have been looking for these resources and, you know, did not grow up with
Are these individuals or associations, groups, mosques?
both, not
Okay.
mosques, but like groups on campuses. Sometimes the MSA, sometimes
And the
other
MSA is
student
the
groups.
Muslim Student Association.
Yes, sometimes
Yeah.
the Muslim Students Association. Other times it's like, you know, students against sexual assault. You know, like those like very issue specific student groups.
Okay.
Sometimes it's actually the university offices themselves. So, for example, we have been working with the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor's Sexual Assault Violence Prevention Center. So it's like staffed by faculty, right? And they recently told us that they were really inspired by our sex talk book and the Rida framework, that they have actually been using that in their incoming freshman curriculum. So the Rida framework is reaching like up to 10,000 incoming freshmen every year.
I want to move on to your sexual violence advocacy and work. So you published a report on Rahma, so dealing with sexual victim survivors across the spectrum of from when they disclose that they've had an event in their life, in the belief, to supporting them and guiding them through the process. So tell us about that and how it's been put out into the communities and in practice.
It began first and foremost with the Responding with Rahma framework. So Rahma means respond by listening, affirm and believe, honor cultural and religious context, maintain privacy and safety, and assist with providing resources and information. And so we developed this tool, you know, sort of kind of urgently, because a lot of folks that were coming to us with their stories were telling us, it's not that we haven't disclosed before. We told our mother, we told our auntie, we told our teacher, and no one believed me. Or they believed me and they told me, there's nothing we can do about this. It's better if you stay quiet, right? So there was always, there were plenty of stories coming in our door about all the ways that survivors of sexual violence were being pushed out, not believed, you know, further harmed and traumatized. And for us, it was like, no, we need to teach communities, everyone in the community. It doesn't matter if you have a formal position or if you're just like a stay-at-home mom, right? Everyone should know how to respond to a disclosure when it is brought to you, and it should be responded to in a timely fashion and in what we like to call a trauma-informed fashion, right? So that the victim in their moment of crisis can get the help that they need. So that was the first framework that we developed, Respond with Rahma. And you know, over the years, we sort of piloted and tested it out and fine-tuned it and worked with different communities and trained, you know, student advocates on campus and chaplains and you know, community leaders and masjid leaders on this framework. And then there emerged a need to take this framework further. So as I mentioned, it can't stop at the individual or interpersonal. We have to also think about communities and institutions. And so then we developed our 2 other frameworks called fulfill your amana, which is for communities who want to work towards preventing sexual violence from occurring in their spaces, and also like when they're thinking about proactively building spaces that are safe. What do they need to do, right? So amana is also an acronym. And then leading with the Dala is our institutional framework, which is for people in positions of leadership who now may be sort of having to respond to a disclosure as an institutional leader, right? So now, in our community for a number of years now, we've been hearing a lot of different disclosures that are happening at the institutional level. And again, even we know this from the Catholic Church, right? Like so much research has been done with the Catholic Church and the Catholic Church victims saying that oftentimes the institutional betrayal is even more painful and traumatizing than the actual occurrence of what happened, right? And so leading with Adala was our attempt and our framework to sort of train institutions and leaders of thinking about like how do you do this in a way that honors the victim's journey to seeking healing and justice, and also recognizing that y'all are an institution, and institutions also want to protect their spaces and their sustainability long term. And so how do we hold both of those tensions and do it in a way that does right by the survivor first and foremost, and also provides the institution with mechanisms and a framework for what accountability can look like, and what transparency and proper training and all of that can look like in their spaces, so that they can ultimately respond in a way that is timely and responsible.
And institutions also have a responsibility to protect their congregants, right? So if they have a notification from a victim of an assault or a sexual violence, and especially if they're a minor, they have a mandatory reporting responsibility that is usually state mandated.
Mhm.
And we know of multiple communities here. And in my previous, one of my previous board services at an organization called Network of Victims Assistance, they conduct for religious organizations and also schools and summer camps and anytime that somebody has a hand to play with a minor, they have mandatory reporting responsibilities. And Darkness to Light is a program that educates those responsible for the young people in their community, whether it's a religious institution or a mosque or church or synagogue, through summer camps or schools, to do that training. And I think that's really absolutely critical. And also it comes from a culturally sensitive way, right? So masjids have their own, as you said, there's a tension between the community and keeping the community safe, and the sustainability, and your work is really critical. So you've done this on college campuses. How has the reception for this been also in the mosques?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the reception has been both hot and cold. So there's been a lot of folks that are really excited about this work. It's about time. We really want to equip our leadership and our advocates and all of that to ultimately do right by when and if, God forbid, an incident happens. And a lot of it is coming from the grief and devastation that they feel from some of these cases that have been very public in our communities. And one of the, I think, a really big source of that grief comes from the fact that oftentimes when you hear about these cases, the victim, and if there's multiple, will share that they didn't just seek help just now, right? That they had tried to seek help either locally or from the institution themselves for years, and they were not listened to or silenced, and the board or leadership didn't do anything about it. And so a lot of that grief and feelings of responsibility comes from that, and the urgency comes from that of like, we don't want this to happen in our community, so what can we do proactively? And then other times, there are a lot of folks that are sort of really deeply uncomfortable with this work, or they take an approach that is sort of a band-aid. Oh, we just want a 2-hour training for our staff to say that we did the training. And then we're going to go on,
Check it off the list.
we're going to check it off the list, and we're just going to go on with our days because nothing's going to happen, kind of thing. Or we wrote the policy, we have the policy, so nothing's going to happen now, right? And
this is a bit of a editorial thing. Sorry to cut you off, but I think almost what it'll take is somebody going to jail.
I don't know.
To scare the community into compliance, to ensure that we keep safe our communities.
But people have gone to jail. We've had those stories, and it's still, I don't think it's still enough. And I think part of that is that, fear-based approaches have never worked, for any issue. They've never worked. I think it's actually, for me, I think it's actually about like shifting something in your brain, right? To like stop thinking about any of this kind of work, whether you're talking about eradicating gender-based violence, or whether you're talking about eradicating racism in your spaces, right? It's not about a checkbox of like, we did the training, we hired the people of color, we're perfect now, right? It's actually about shifting what's happening in your brain and understanding that this is a culture shift that has to happen in the organization, and that, more than anything else, requires interrogating your own biases and assumptions, and flipping them on their head, and really disrupting and actively practicing how to be anti-racist, or how to be supportive of anti-sexual assault, anti-sexual violence spaces, and things like that. And that requires a lot more work, because now you are addressing the root causes of these issues.
So I guess this gets to one of my, kind of 3 last questions here. And it gets to what do you think will unlock that mind shift, right? So that mindset shift that takes this almost cultural shame that we assign to the sex talk, to sexual reproductive health rights and advocacy, and victims being heard and listened to and advocated for.
You can't change an entire community's mind, but if you find the key stakeholders or the key champions that you can win over, and they do that work instead of you coming in as a stranger, it's easier for people to trust their own people. So I think that's one way of like really being able to identify who can be the champions and ambassadors for this work from the inside, because this work has to be community led. It can't be, I'm going to come into this mosque because they had this really bad thing happen, and I'm just going to teach you how to do this, right? That's not effective. It has to be within the community. And the second thing is, like, I don't like that this is a function of human interaction, but oftentimes people's mind changes when it impacts them. And I hate to put it that way, because you shouldn't have to wait for your child or your sibling or your mother or somebody to experience something in order for you to care. But oftentimes that is what shifts people, is like, I didn't know how hard this was until it happened to someone I loved, and things like that. And I saw firsthand the ways in which they were dismissed or disrespected or shamed. And I don't want that for my child, right? And again, like I said, that's not ideal. I wish humans didn't work that way, and that you don't need that to empathize with the situation. But oftentimes that is what we've seen in terms of unlocking that and helping people shift. There is a power in storytelling. And at the risk of, like, of course, like, again, there's storytelling that is sensationalized, that media comes in and takes it and, sensationalizes it. And then there's authentic storytelling where, people have the agency over their own stories, and they can share the details they want to share and not share the details they don't want to share. And I do think there's a power in that, like being able to hear about somebody's experience that is different than yours and being open to that, not going in with a closed mind, but like being open to hearing somebody else's truth. There is a power to that, and that has shifted a lot of the ways in which people approach each other.
What's your thing you're most proud of in your time with Heart?
I can't name one. I'm sorry. We've actually, mashallah, like there are so many things that we're about to be 15. So that's the first thing. This is our 15th year.
Happy birthday.
And that's really exciting for us. But there's a couple of things I made a list of 5. So the first is we wrote The Sex Talk, A Muslim's Guide to Healthy Sex and Relationships. And this book is being now currently used at universities, in public school systems, and community-led book clubs. So I think that's incredible in and of itself. It's a book that is also community conversation. Our mutual aid fund, I literally just ran the numbers yesterday. We've distributed almost $500,000 of financial assistance in just 5 years to Muslims that are, seeking health and healing and safety. We released just recently, the Raham framework, which is Reproductive Agency Honoring Impacted Muslims framework to help Muslims guide as they navigate their sexual and reproductive health decision making. And it was on billboards all over Chicago and in Times Square just this last year. Our research has been published in numerous academic journals and books. And our workshops and trainings ultimately have reached more than 20,000 people across the country. So these are just like really tangible accomplishments. But I think what I'm most proud of is like just the people and the community that we've built and the trust that we've built. How, when people experience our programming, they keep coming back. They want to bring this to their communities. They want to be ambassadors for the work. I'm really like proud of like the ways in which we've been able to build that community and through the people that do this work.
Well, you are really a testament to the power of the work, and you're doing work in a very complicated and difficult space within the Muslim community, and it takes those pioneers really to challenge the status quo of how things have generally been done, to bring out education and healing and victims support that you are. So with that, I really want to congratulate you.
Thank you.
Where can people find more information on Heart?
Yes, www.hearttogrow.org.
And can they donate on that site?
100%.
As well?
They can donate.
Okay, to the Victims Fund.
Yes. There's actually, when you donate, it gives you choices whether you want it to just be a generic donation or if you want it to go to a specific fund.
That's fantastic. So with that, I encourage our listeners to go to Heart's website, hearttogrow.org, and encourage you to donate to a program of choice. With that, Nadiah Mohajir, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This show's been produced by Danny Vagnoni, with music created and written by the artist known as Sahari, with artwork produced by Nadiah Afzal. I'm your host, Kareem Afzal. See you next time.